The challenge of strength. Zirak stood tall in the war chamber of the Korthan Empire, her sharp crimson eyes scanning the holographic display before her. The swirling image of Earth floated in the center, glowing with soft blue light. It was a fragile world, home to an even weaker species, humans. She smirked. These creatures call themselves warriors, she scoffed, crossing her powerful arms. They are small, slow, and soft. Their bodies are weak, and their lifespans are short. They should not even be called a species. They are nothing more than insects waiting to be crushed. The other Korthan warriors in the room chuckled in agreement. They were tall, muscular, and built for war. Their species had conquered dozens of planets, their strength unmatched in the galaxy. The idea that humans could resist them was laughable. But General Torvath, the supreme commander of the invasion, did not laugh. His piercing gaze landed on Zirak. And yet, he said in a deep voice, "These weak creatures have survived wars against empires far stronger than they should have been able to defeat." Zirak frowned. She had heard the stories. Humans were strange. They had no claws, no natural armor, no deadly fangs. And yet, in every battle they'd fought, they refused to surrender. They bled, they suffered, and yet they kept standing. Torvath turned to the hologram, zooming in on Earth's military bases. "Your mission is simple, Zirak. Go to their training grounds, observe their warriors, and report back. I want to understand what makes these creatures so persistent. Why do they not break when they should?" Zirak grinned. "I will not only observe them, General," she said. "I will prove their weakness. I will see their so-called strength for myself." Arrival on Earth. The spaceship landed in a remote location, hidden from human technology. Zirak stepped out, her armor gleaming under the pale sunlight. She activated her cloaking device, rendering herself invisible to human eyes. Ahead of her, she saw a human military base. Soldiers ran across an open training field, some lifting heavy weights, others sparring in hand-to-hand combat. She watched closely. This was supposed to be their elite training ground, the best human warriors. What she saw made her laugh. They struggled. They sweated. Some fell to the ground, too exhausted to continue. Others groaned in pain after a hard hit from their training partners. Zirak shook her head. This was pathetic. She observed a tall human instructor walking among the tired recruits. His face was lined with age, his uniform decorated with medals. He was speaking, his voice sharp and commanding. "You think you're tired," he barked. "You think you're in pain. Good. Pain means you're alive. Pain means you keep moving." The soldiers pushed themselves up, wiping sweat from their faces. Zirak's amusement faded slightly. Strange. They are struggling, yet they refuse to stop. She focused on one particular soldier, a young man with a scar on his cheek. He was clearly exhausted, his arms shaking as he struggled to do another push-up. The instructor knelt beside him. "Do you want to quit, soldier?" The young man panted heavily but clenched his jaw. "No, sir." "Then stand up." With a grunt, the soldier forced himself to his feet, despite the pain. Zirak narrowed her eyes. Why does he keep going? He should know his limits. He should stop. But the human didn't stop. Mocking human weakness, Zirak continued watching for hours. The humans were slow. They were fragile. They lacked the natural strength of the Korthans. And yet, they did not give up. Every time one of them fell, they got back up. Every time their bodies screamed in pain, they pushed forward. She sneered. "Foolish creatures," she muttered. "They push themselves beyond their limits, as if that will make them stronger." She turned her gaze to a different section of the base, where humans were practicing combat drills. Two soldiers faced off, sparring with fists and feet. Their strikes were not powerful, but they were precise. They used speed, tactics, and most annoyingly, they helped each other improve. She observed a moment where one fighter was knocked down hard. Instead of staying down, the human grinned, stood up, and got ready to fight again. Zirak clenched her fists. Corthans never fought like this. In her world, weakness was punished. Strength was survival. There was no mercy, no second chances. Humans are reckless, she muttered. They fight as if they have nothing to lose. For a long time, she believed humans were weak. But watching them now, a small thought crept into her mind. What if their weakness was their strength? She shook the thought away. Impossible. Strength is all that matters. Her mission was to observe, and she had seen enough. She would report back to the general and tell him what he wanted to hear. Humans were weak. Victory would be easy. But as she prepared to leave, she saw something that made her stop in her tracks. Something that sent a shiver down her spine. A human soldier, the same one who had been too exhausted to continue training earlier, was now fighting against 3 opponents at once. His movements were sluggish, his body covered in bruises, yet he refused to fall. No matter how many times he was knocked down, he got back up. His strength was not in his body, but in his will. And for the first time in her life, Zirak felt something unfamiliar. It wasn't anger, it wasn't amusement. It was fear, a strange kind of strength. Zirak had seen countless battles, had crushed weaker species under her heel, had stood victorious on the blood-soaked fields of war. Strength ruled the galaxy. Power determined survival. That was the Corthan way. But as she stood in the shadows, watching these frail creatures push beyond exhaustion, beyond logic, beyond pain, she felt something she had never felt before. Doubt. The young human soldier, the one who should have given up, was still standing. His body trembled, sweat dripped from his brow. His knuckles were raw from endless strikes against his training opponents, and yet he did not fall. Zirak narrowed her eyes. Why? Why did he keep fighting? She clenched her fists, suppressing the unfamiliar feeling creeping into her mind. This was foolishness, weakness. This was not strength. Yet, she could not look away. The test of endurance. The human instructor paced in front of the gathered recruits. His voice was sharp, cutting through the heavy breathing and exhausted groans. "You think war is fair," he barked. "You think your enemy is going to stop just because you're tired, because your legs hurt, because your arms are weak." He stepped toward the soldier who had collapsed earlier, the one Zirak had been watching. The instructor pointed at him. "Darius, tell me, what do you do when your body fails you?" The young soldier, Darius, straightened despite his exhaustion. His voice was hoarse, but steady. "You keep moving, sir." The instructor smirked. "And why is that?" Darius hesitated for only a second before answering, his words slow, but filled with something Zirak could not quite understand. "Because pain doesn't mean stop. Pain means keep going." A murmur ran through the recruits. Some nodded, others clenched their jaws. They believed his words. Zirak tilted her head. This was strange. Corthans did not train like this. If a soldier fell, they were left behind. If a warrior showed weakness, they were discarded. Strength was all that mattered. And yet, here was a species that did the opposite. They embraced weakness. They suffered. They bled. They failed. But they refused to stop. Zirak felt her gut twist with something unrecognizable. Why does this disturb me? She forced the thought away. This was human nonsense, a weakness disguised as strength. Their bodies were still frail, their flesh still breakable. But something inside her whispered, then why are they still standing? The fight that should have ended. Night fell over the training grounds, but the soldiers kept moving. The day's exercises had been brutal, yet a few remained behind, sparring under the dim lights of the base. Zirak watched as Darius stepped into the ring once again. His body should have given up long ago. His arms were slow, his legs shaky, but he stood ready. Another soldier, taller and stronger, faced him. The fight began. Darius dodged the first strike, but barely. The second blow landed against his ribs, making him grunt in pain. But instead of retreating, he attacked. His punches weren't the strongest, but they were relentless. Again and again, even as his opponent knocked him down, he got back up. Zirek's hands tightened at her sides. "This is foolish," she muttered. "He has lost." And yet, Darius refused to stay down. Each time he was knocked to the ground, he rolled, gasped for breath, and stood again. He would not stop. His opponent hesitated now. Confused, frustrated. The fight should have ended long ago, but Darius would not fall. Zirek felt something rise in her chest. Not anger, not amusement. Something else. Something close to respect. The mind of a warrior. Zirek was still watching when the fight finally ended, not because Darius had fallen, but because the instructor stepped in. "Enough," he ordered. His gaze flickered to Darius, who stood, barely, but still standing. The instructor shook his head, but there was no disappointment in his voice, only something that sounded like approval. "You're not the strongest here, Darius. You're not the fastest." But he paused. "You don't quit, and that makes you dangerous." Darius nodded, wiping sweat from his brow. He did not look victorious, but he did not look defeated either. Zirek exhaled slowly. She had come here to prove human weakness, to confirm what she already knew. And yet, she had witnessed something else. They were not fast. They were not strong. But they were something else entirely. Unyielding. The warrior's dilemma. As Zirek turned to leave, her mind was clouded with thoughts she did not want. Why does this disturb me so much? Why do I feel uncertain? She thought of the Korthan warriors back home, their strength, their power. But now, for the first time, she wondered, would they have lasted as long as that human? She clenched her jaw, shaking off the thought. Impossible. Korthans were superior. This was just human stubbornness, not true strength. But deep down, she wasn't sure anymore. As she walked away, she cast one last glance at the humans, still training in the night, still standing, still fighting. And for the first time in her life, Zirek felt something she had never known before. Doubt. The battle begins. Zirek had returned to her ship with a mind full of conflict. She had been raised to believe that strength was absolute, that true warriors crushed their enemies with superior power. Yet, on this backwater world, she had witnessed something she could not explain. Humans who refused to break. It should not have mattered. Weakness disguised as resilience was still weakness. At least, that's what she told herself. But as she stood before the holographic war table in the Korthan command vessel, she felt something unsettling in her chest, a sensation she refused to name. General Xorvath's piercing gaze locked onto her. "You have observed them. Now tell me, are these humans as weak as we expect?" Zirek hesitated for a fraction of a second, something she had never done before. "Yes," she finally said. "They are physically inferior. Their strength is minimal. Their endurance, while unusual, is not enough to challenge us." It was the answer she was expected to give. Xorvath nodded, satisfied. "Good, then we move forward. The invasion begins at dawn." Zirek clenched her fists. She should have felt pride, anticipation for the battle ahead. But all she felt was unease. And she did not know why. The Korthans strike. The first attack came like a storm. In the early hours of the morning, before the human soldiers could react, the Korthans descended from the sky. Zirek stood on the battlefield, her armor gleaming in the pale light. Explosions thundered across the landscape as Korthan warships rained fire upon the human base. Smoke curled into the sky, and sirens blared in the distance. Humans ran to their weapons, scrambling into defensive positions. Zirek's lips curled. This would be over soon. Her warriors charge, towering over the humans, their advanced energy weapons slicing through the weak defenses. Korthans did not hesitate. They did not retreat. They overwhelmed. Zirek stepped forward, watching as a group of human soldiers took cover behind a crumbling barricade. One of them was Darius. She recognized him immediately. The soldier who had refused to quit during training, the one who had planted doubt in her mind. Now she would see what his so-called willpower was truly worth. The humans refused to fall. Zirak expected the humans to falter, to break under the might of the Korthan warriors. But they did not. Darius barked orders, his voice steady despite the chaos. His team responded with swift precision, returning fire, dodging Korthan strikes, laying traps to slow their enemies down. Zirak narrowed her eyes. They should be afraid. They should be running. Instead, they stood their ground. She watched as a grenade exploded near Darius, sending him sprawling across the battlefield. A Korthan warrior charged toward him, blade raised. But before the strike could land, Darius rolled onto his back and fired, blasting the Korthan in the chest. Zirak inhaled sharply. That wasn't luck. That was instinct. She looked around. Humans should not have been able to last this long. The Korthans were stronger, faster, deadlier. But humans did not fight like Korthans. They adapted. They used the battlefield itself, turning rubble into cover, setting traps in unexpected places, moving unpredictably. And more than anything else, they refused to surrender. The soldier who wouldn't die. Zirak kept her gaze on Darius as he fought, injured but relentless. A blast tore through his side, searing his armor. He stumbled but did not fall. Another Korthan struck him with the blunt end of a plasma rifle, sending him crashing into the dirt. That should have been the end. But Darius pushed himself up, gripping a fallen soldier's rifle, and kept firing. Her breath caught. He had nothing left, his body broken, his allies dwindling. Any other species would have given up, but Darius refused to die. She had fought alongside the strongest Korthan warriors, seen them wield devastating power. But even the best of them, when faced with certain death, would retreat to survive another day. Not humans. Zirak watched as Darius locked eyes with a Korthan commander, a warrior twice his size. Instead of fear, Zirak saw something else in Darius's expression. Defiance. The commander struck. Darius blocked. The two clashed, one fueled by raw power, the other by something Zirak could not yet name. And then the impossible happened. Darius, bleeding, beaten, exhausted, drove a knife straight into the Korthan's throat. The commander fell. Zirak took a sharp breath. That should not have been possible. A human should not have been able to withstand that much damage. A human should not have had the strength to deliver a final blow. But Darius was still standing. The turning point. Zirak felt something shift inside her. For the first time, she questioned everything she had ever known about strength. She had always believed that true warriors were those who crushed their enemies, who dominated through sheer force. But watching Darius fight, suffer, and refuse to break, she realized something terrifying. Perhaps strength was not about power at all. Perhaps it was about something else. Something the Korthans did not understand. Something the humans had in abundance. Something Zirak now feared. A choice to make. The battle raged on, but Zirak was no longer focused on victory. She was focused on understanding. What made these humans so different? What drove them to fight when they had already lost? She had spent her life believing that only the strong survived. But today, she had witnessed something new. Not power, not speed, not dominance, but an unbreakable will. As she watched Darius drag himself forward, still fighting, still refusing to fall, she knew one thing for certain. The Korthans had underestimated humanity. And for the first time in her life, Zirak was afraid that they would lose. The human who wouldn't die. Zirak had seen warriors fall before. She had watched them bleed, had heard their final cries before the battlefield swallowed them whole. But this was different. Darius should have fallen long ago. His body was broken, his armor cracked and scorched. Blood smeared across his face, his hands, his uniform. He should have been dead 10 times over. And yet, he stood, not out of desperation, not out of foolishness, but out of something Zirek could not name. The Korthans' advantage. The battle was tipping in favor of the Korthans. The sheer power of their warriors, their advanced weapons, their brutal tactics, it was overwhelming the human defenses. Zirek moved through the battlefield, watching as her fellow Korthans pressed forward, cutting down resistance with ease. The humans were losing ground, and yet they did not surrender. When Korthans won a war, the enemy was erased. They surrendered. They fell apart. They were crushed under the might of superior warriors. Humans. They didn't stop. They didn't run. They mourned their dead, but they didn't break. Zirek felt an unfamiliar weight settle in her chest. Perhaps this wasn't a victory after all. The wounded warrior. She turned her gaze toward a group of human medics working desperately to stabilize their fallen. And there, at the center of it all, was Darius. He should have been dead. He should have been dead. Yet there he was, breathing, barely conscious, but alive. His uniform was torn, his body covered in deep wounds and bruises, but his hand was clenched into a fist. Even unconscious, his body refused to relax, refused to surrender. Zirek's throat tightened. This soldier had been thrown against death itself, had fought against forces far beyond his strength, had suffered wounds no warrior should have been able to endure. And yet he lived. Not by luck, not by chance, but because he had willed it. She had never seen anything like it. A lesson in loss. She turned away, forcing herself to walk toward the Korthan command post. The other warriors were celebrating, reveling in their triumph. Yet, for the first time in her life, Zirek felt no pride. As she approached General Xorvath, he turned to face her, his dark eyes filled with satisfaction. "The humans have been crushed," he said simply. As expected, Zirek hesitated. Had they? She thought of Darius. She thought of the humans still standing, still preparing for the next battle, still refusing to surrender even after losing everything. "Crushed?" she asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Xorvath gave her a sharp look. "Do you doubt our victory, Zirek?" She met his gaze. What could she say? That these humans were stronger than they seemed. That victory did not feel like victory at all. That for the first time in her life, she had seen warriors who fought not for conquest, not for glory, but because they simply refused to fall. No, the Korthans did not understand such things, so she said nothing. But deep inside, the doubt continued to grow. The humans do not mourn like others. As night fell, Zirek found herself watching the human camp from a distance. She had expected them to be weak in the aftermath of battle, to be broken. But instead, they gathered together. She had seen other species mourn their dead before. Korthans did not mourn. Warriors who fell were simply unworthy of remembrance. Other species grieved, wept, collapsed under their sorrow. But humans, they mourned with fire in their eyes. She saw them comforting each other, not in defeat, but in resolve. She saw the soldiers tending to their weapons, preparing for the next battle, not running from it. She saw Darius, still wounded, being helped up by his comrades. He groaned in pain, yet when another soldier offered to let him rest, he simply shook his head. "I'm not done," he murmured. Zirek inhaled sharply. This was not how a defeated army behaved. They should have been broken. They should have been crushed. Instead, they were preparing to rise again. She had spent her entire life believing that strength was about power. But what if she had been wrong? What if strength was not about never falling, but about always getting back up? The warrior's choice. That night, Zirek did not sleep. She sat in silence, watching the battlefield, replaying the day's events over and over again in her mind. And then, for the first time, she asked herself a question she had never dared to ask before. Had she chosen the wrong side? It was an impossible thought. Treasonous. And yet, as she watched the human soldiers move, as she listened to their voices, wounded, exhausted, yet still determined, she knew she could not ignore it. She had never respected an enemy before. She had never feared one either. And yet here she was, shaken to her very core. Perhaps strength was not about being born powerful. Perhaps true power was earned. And if that was the case, then humans might be the strongest species she had ever encountered. She clenched her fists. If the Korthans did not understand that, then they would lose this war. For the first time in her life, Zirak was faced with a choice: to continue following the path of her people, or to follow something she had never known before: honor. The war was far from over. And now, for the first time, she wasn't sure where she stood. The turning point. Zirak had never hesitated before. Her entire life had been defined by war, by conquest, by the brutal certainty that strength ruled all things. She had stood on the battlefields of a dozen planets, had crushed weaker species beneath the might of the Korthan Empire, had watched enemies kneel before her without question. Victory was all that mattered. And yet, as she stood in the aftermath of the battle, watching humans tend to their wounded, watching their eyes burn with something more dangerous than power, she felt the crack in her certainty widen, because she had seen something today that no Korthan commander had ever accounted for. Humans did not accept defeat. They did not surrender. Even when their bodies broke, their spirits refused to die. And that terrified her more than any enemy she had ever faced. The warning that went unheard. She returned to the Korthan command post with a storm raging inside her mind. General Xorvath stood at the center of the war chamber, his imposing figure illuminated by the glow of holographic displays. Other commanders surrounded him, discussing strategies for the final obliteration of human resistance. Zirak stepped forward, her voice steady despite the battle waging inside her. "We need to reconsider our strategy," she said. Silence fell across the room. Xorvath turned, his dark gaze locking onto hers. "Reconsider." His voice was low, dangerous. "Explain yourself, warrior." Zirak hesitated. The words she was about to say, words of warning, felt like betrayal. And yet, she could not stop them. "The humans, they are not like the others we have conquered," she said carefully. "They do not break like other species. They adapt. They endure. If we do not approach this war differently, we will." "Enough." Xorvath's voice cut through the air like a blade. Zirak stiffened as the general stepped forward, towering over her. His eyes were filled with cold amusement, as if she were nothing more than a foolish child. "You allow sentiment to cloud your mind," he said. "Perhaps you have spent too much time among the vermin." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the other Korthan warriors. Zirak's fists clenched at her sides. This was not sentiment. This was logic. She had witnessed it firsthand. The humans did not operate by the same rules. They do not fight for conquest. She tried again. They fight for survival. For each other. We are underestimating them. Xorvath let out a short, cruel laugh. Underestimating them. He gestured toward the holomap of Earth, where Korthan forces were already advancing. "We have crushed their defenses. They retreat. They fall." Zirak's jaw tightened. "But they do not break." She knew that now. And if the Korthans refused to see it, they would pay for their arrogance. But she said nothing more, because she knew that in the eyes of her people, she had already said too much. An unlikely rescue. That night, Zirak made her decision. She could not let this war continue the way the Korthans intended. Not because she had grown soft, not because she had sympathy for humans, but because for the first time in her life, she understood true strength. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that the Korthans had chosen the wrong enemy. She moved quickly through the shadows, her steps silent, her cloak active. She had studied the layout of the human base for weeks, had mapped every pathway, every exit, every guard rotation. But this time, she was not here to observe. She was here to act. She made her way toward the med tents where the wounded were being treated. Her sharp eyes scanned the area, searching. There, Darius lay inside one of the tents, his wounds still fresh, his body weakened, but his eyes burning with the same fire she had seen before. He was alive. And if he lived, the humans still had hope. She stepped forward, her presence hidden in the darkness, but before she could reach him, a human guard turned. "Who's there?" Zirak tensed. She could take him down silently, but that was not the path she wanted to take. Not anymore. Instead, she did something she had never done before. She deactivated her cloak. The moment she appeared, the guard's eyes widened in shock. His hand went straight for his weapon, but Zirak raised her own, not to kill, but to show she did not intend to fight. The guard hesitated, his hand hovering over his gun. Zirak took a slow breath. "I am not your enemy," she said. A moment passed, then another. Finally, the guard exhaled sharply. "You have about 10 seconds to explain before I call reinforcements." Zirak's voice was steady. "I am here to help." The conversation that changed everything. Minutes later, Zirak stood inside the tent, face to face with the man who had shattered everything she believed about war. Darius. His face was pale, his body weak from blood loss, but his eyes were sharp, filled with the same unyielding will as before. The moment he saw her, his muscles tensed. "Came to finish the job," he rasped. Zirak shook her head. "No." Darius narrowed his eyes. "Then why are you here?" For the first time in her life, Zirak did not have an easy answer. She had fought for her people for years, had conquered, had destroyed, had stood among the strongest warriors in the galaxy. But now she stood in the tent of an enemy she had come to respect. And she found herself saying the impossible. "I believe you can win." Darius blinked. He looked at her like she was insane. Zirak couldn't blame him. "I don't expect you to trust me," she said. "I would not trust me either. But if you wish to defeat the Korthans, you will need more than weapons. You will need information. You will need strategy." Darius studied her, eyes unreadable. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he gave her a slow, painful smile. "That sounds an awful lot like treason." Zirak exhaled. "It is." A long pause. Then, to her surprise, Darius laughed. It was hoarse, weak, but it was real. Zirak tilted her head. "What is funny?" Darius wiped blood from his mouth, shaking his head. "I just never thought I'd see the day a Korthan warrior would betray their own people for a bunch of weak humans." Zirak let out a slow breath. Neither had she. But here she was, making the choice that would change the war forever. The warrior's choice. The moment Zirak stepped out of the human base, she knew there was no turning back. The weight of her decision settled in her chest, heavier than any armor she had ever worn. She was no longer a Korthan warrior fighting for conquest. She was a traitor. Her people would hunt her down for this. If she was captured, she would not be granted a warrior's death. No, traitors were erased from existence, their names, their victories, their very legacies wiped from Korthan history. And yet, she felt no regret. Because for the first time, she was making a choice not out of duty, not out of fear, but because it was right. She had spent her life believing that strength was everything. But now, after witnessing the humans fight, suffer, and refuse to break, she knew true strength when she saw it, and it did not belong to the Korthans. The betrayal of a warrior. Zirak moved quickly through the darkened landscape, her mind racing. She had bought herself only a small window of time before the humans decided whether or not to trust her. Darius had listened, but that did not mean he believed her. Humans were not fools. They would not accept an enemy so easily. And they were right not to. But trust could be earned. She had given them vital information. Korthan troop movements, weaknesses in their supply lines, the general strategy for wiping out human resistance. It was enough to turn the tide of the war. if they believed her, if they used it in time. Zirak knew the Korthan Empire well enough to know that if humanity did not strike soon, they would not get another chance. Her betrayal would not go unnoticed for long. And when the Korthans realized what she had done, they would come for her. The wrath of the Korthans. She reached the outskirts of the Korthan encampment just before dawn. The air was thick with the scent of war, plasma burns, smoke, the metallic tang of blood. Her people were preparing for the final assault, oblivious to the storm she had set in motion. She needed to move fast. But before she could take another step, a deep voice shattered the silence. Zirak. Her body tensed. She knew that voice. Slowly, she turned. General Xorvath stood before her, his massive frame silhouetted against the glow of Korthan war machines. His crimson armor gleamed under the rising sun, his piercing gaze locked onto her like a predator studying prey. Zirak forced herself to remain still, to keep her expression unreadable. "You are out late," Xorvath said, stepping closer. His voice was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge beneath it. Zirak met his gaze. "I was scouting the battlefield." A slow smile spread across his face. "Were you?" Her grip tightened on the dagger hidden beneath her cloak. She could feel it now, the way the other Korthan warriors nearby had gone silent, the way their attention had shifted toward her. They knew. She had been exposed. The price of defiance. Xorvath exhaled, almost disappointed. "I had such high hopes for you, Zirak," he mused. "A warrior without weakness. A future warlord." His expression darkened. "Yet here you are, siding with the vermin." Zirak kept her stance steady, but inside, her heart pounded. This was it. She had only two options, fight or run. And she had never run from a battle in her life. "I am not siding with the weak," she said, voice steady. "I am siding with the strong." Xorvath's eyes flashed. "You dare call these creatures strong?" "Yes," Zirak said without hesitation. "Because they do not break. Because they do not surrender. Because they fight for something greater than themselves." Xorvath's expression twisted into disgust. "You have been infected by their weakness," he snarled. "No," she said softly. "I have been awakened to my own." She did not wait for him to reply. She struck first. Her blade shot forward, aiming for his throat. But Xorvath was faster. He caught her wrist in an iron grip, twisting sharply. Pain exploded through her arm, but Zirak didn't falter. She pivoted, slamming her knee into his ribs, forcing him to release her. The other warriors moved in, but she was faster, a blur of motion, striking, dodging, slipping through their grasp like smoke. For the first time in her life, she was not fighting for victory. She was fighting to survive. She tore through the camp, taking down guards with brutal efficiency, until she reached the edge of the battlefield. Her lungs burned. Blood dripped from a fresh wound on her shoulder. But she was alive. And she was free. For now. A war reborn. Zirak ran, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. There was no going back now. She was an enemy of her own people, a hunted traitor. But she was not alone. For the first time, she had allies who would not abandon her the moment she showed weakness. The humans would not trust her easily, but they would trust results. And she was going to give them victory. The Korthans had made a mistake. They had underestimated humanity. They thought humans were weak. They thought humans would break. They thought they had won. But Zirak had seen the truth. And now she was going to make sure the Korthan Empire saw it too. The beginning of the end. She reached the human base just as the sun crested the horizon. Darius was waiting for her. The moment he saw the fresh wounds on her body, his expression hardened. "They know," he guessed. Zirak nodded. "They will come." Darius exhaled. "Then we better be ready." His eyes met hers, and for the first time, Zirak saw something in them that she had never seen before. Not defiance. Not hatred. Trust. It was not spoken aloud, But she felt it. She had made her choice, and there was no turning back. The war was no longer just between Corthans and humans. Now, it was her war too, and she would fight to the end.